Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to extend to you a very warm welcome on a warm, almost summer day. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences, Institut für Wissenschaften von Menschen, those of you who know us by our German name. It's a premiere today. I would like to extend a warm welcome equally in the name of our co-organizers, and that is the Diplomatic Academy, which has an English title which I just learned of recently. It's called the Vienna School of International Studies, but most of you know it as the Diplomatische Akademie. And I would like to express a special gratitude for this first-time cooperation, I hope the first of many, to its director, Professor Briggs, who is here with us this evening. But of course, my deep gratitude goes to Professor Skidelsky for two reasons. One, that Lord Skidelsky agreed to give a public talk, but he agreed to give it on his birthday. And of course, I'm very happy that Lady Skidelsky could join us on this occasion. I don't know if she would have come for the Patočka Memorial Lecture, but she's certainly here for his birthday. So warm welcome to you too. It is the 30th Patočka Memorial Lecture, which the IWM hosts today. It's a lecture in honor of the Czech philosopher and human rights activist Jan Patočka. And since our institutional foundation in 1982, we have housed the archives and a research program in honor of Patočka at the IWM. Our new permanent fellow, Ludger Hagedorn, who is with us today as well, has been responsible for maintaining this program, looking after the archives, and therefore this sets a cornerstone of the institutional building of the IWM as well. Since 1987, we have organized the annual lecture in memory of Jan Patočka, and the speakers have included Nancy Fraser, Martin Walls, Sir Edward Said, Jacques Derrida, Charles Taylor, and George Soros. Professor Skidelsky hardly needs an introduction. However, I would be failing in my duty as a host if I were not to say a few words about his remarkable academic achievements, but also his really fascinating political biography. But first of all, I'd like to say we are proud to host him as our Krzysztof Michalski Fellow, a fellowship in honor of the founder of the IWM. And he's working on a project about which he's not going to talk tonight, and that is the project on revolutionary and post-revolutionary disruption in the Primoria region of the Far Eastern Russia, 1917-1922. Now, of course, this is, for those of you who are historians of Europe, an interesting period because this is the period from the October Revolution to 1922, the summer of 1922, when the Bolsheviks established their power in this region. But of course, it's not only about the Bolshevik seizure of power, his project, but it also explores the precariousness of Russia's hold over its Far Eastern empire. So this is a subject which has, of course, current resonances as well. Lord Skidelsky is Professor Emeritus of Political Economy at Warwick University. He's an honorary fellow of Jesus College, Oxford. He was elected a fellow of the British Academy in History and Economics in 1994, and since 1991, he has been a member of the British House of Lords. Originally a member of the Labour Party, he left it to become the founding member of the Social Democratic Party, which remained his political home until its dissolution in 1992. He then joined the Conservative Party and became its chief opposition spokesman, first for culture, then for treasury affairs, until he was forced to leave the party for his opposition to NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999. For those of you who have been following the British press, just a gentle reminder, in September 2015, he endorsed Jeremy Corbyn's campaign in the Labour Party leadership election, and he stated in his endorsement with great foresight, he wrote in The Guardian, "Millions in Europe rightly feel that the current economic order fails to serve their interests. then it would be a mistake to ignore these concerns. Alas, this was a warning that went unheeded, with consequences not only for Britain, but also for the EU. Among his numerous academic achievements, I only want to mention two. His magnum opus is, of course, his highly acclaimed 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes. The first volume published in 1983, the second in 1992, and the third volume, Fighting for Britain. So the first one is Hope's Betrayed. It's the early years, 1883 to 1920, and the final volume, Fighting for Britain, 1937 to 46, which won several prizes and was shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction Writing in 2001. And then he did something very, very unusual. For someone who had written a 3-volume biography, he decided to then write a 1-volume biography of Keynes, condensing some of his own work, but adding some very interesting things to it well. And this was then, in 2009, the title, The Return of the Master. This is, of course, the revival of Keynesianism after the 2008 financial crisis, which probably prompted him to publish this condensed work. And of course, as Paul Krugman said in his review of the book, let's not forget the context of the book was the anti-Keynesian counter-revolution in the neoliberal economic policies that had brought about such a havoc. So the book is a very interesting one. The 1 volume, I think, I probably can expect people to read, if not the 3. It's very, very interesting, not only as a biography of Keynes, but also as a future economic program. But it's equally interesting for me, as a sociologist, that this is a trenchant critique of the discipline of economics, which, to my delight, he says very clearly, needs a sociological complement. He reminds us in the book that one of Keynes' core insights lay in acknowledging that there is uncertainty in the world, uncertainty that cannot be reduced to statistical probabilities, and this uncertainty accounts for the instability of market economies. The question then he seeks to answer in the book is also, how should one act in the face of such uncertainty? But the book is not only about Keynesian economic ideas. Interestingly, in the chapter titled Monetary Reform, I found very interesting biographical details about Keynes's love life. And the chapter tells us about his passionate love affair with a Russian ballerina, Lydia Lobokova, who was then later his wife. So the book is full of surprises. I can only give you this little teaser. In 2012, Lord Skidelsky published the much-discussed book, How Much is Enough? Money and the Good Life. There is a German translation of this, Wie viel ist genug? Von Wachstumswahn zu einer Ökonomie des guten Lebens. A book which he co-authored with his son, Edward Skidelsky. It addresses really fundamental questions, some of which will be part of the talk today, on about what constitutes a good life and what is the true value of money, and why do we work such long hours merely to acquire greater wealth. With that, let me turn to Lord Skidelsky, give him the word, and the title of his lecture, as you know, is Will the Population Become Redundant? I hope he has an optimistic answer to this.
Rector, ladies and gentlemen, I'm privileged to be spending 3 months at the Institute of the Human Sciences as Krzysztof Mikalski Fellow and honored to be giving the Jan Patočka lecture. In my 3 weeks in Vienna so far, I've had the chance to learn more about these two remarkable men, and their writing has influenced what I want to say this evening. They both emphasize the need for people to feel at home in the world, A society, wrote Patočka, is decadent if it encourages a life addicted to what is inhuman by its very nature. And it's in that spirit that I want to explore the impact of technology on the human condition, and especially on work. Is technology making the human race redundant, materially and spiritually, both as producers of wealth and as producers of meaning? For an optimistic answer to this question, let me turn to John Maynard Keynes. In an essay he wrote in 1930, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, Keynes predicts that technological progress will produce so much more extra wealth that in about 100 years' time, that is, 100 years on from 1930, or even less, our working week will be reduced to 15 hours, that is 3 hours a day. The process, he warns, though, is unlikely to be smooth, and this is what he says. No, he doesn't. He does on here. Does he on there? Yes. We are being afflicted with a new disease, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor. But this is only a temporary phase. All it means is that in the long run, mankind is solving its economic problem. So, ever since machinery became an active part of production in the early 19th century, redundancy has been seen either as a promise or as a threat. And it's as a promise that it's been dominant in economics, with redundancy seen as a transitional problem, confined to particular groups of workers, like the hand loom weavers in the early 19th century. Over time, the optimistic vision was that part of the displaced workforce would be absorbed in new jobs, and part of it in the greater leisure made possible by improved productivity. However, the fear of permanent redundancy of a large fraction of the workforce, that is, its forced removal from gainful employment, has never been absent. The reason is that unemployment is immediate, whereas the gains, that is, are promised, are indirect and longer term. In other words, an immediate threat versus a long-term promise. And this fear of redundancy has two roots. The first is people's fear that machines will rob them of their livelihood. The second is that machines will rob them of their purpose in life. Sociologists stress the importance of work in giving meaning to life. On the other hand, economists see work as purely instrumental, an instrument for buying things that people want. If it can actually be done by instruments, so much the better. It may free up people for more valuable pursuits, and I'm using work here loosely in the sense of having to work. It's not surprising, then, that fear of redundancy surfaces whenever there's a burst of technological innovation. We're living through such a period now, with the spread of automation. The headlines tell us that robots are gobbling up human jobs at an unprecedented rate, that up to 30% of present jobs will be automated within 20 or 30 years. And the jobs themselves are becoming ever more precarious. So the old question is being posed ever more urgently: are machines a threat or a promise? In a very few minutes, I want to sketch the background to this discussion. The issue isn't straightforward. It's always involved questions about the relationship between work and the good life. And I want to divide what I want to say into four parts: the world of work before the Industrial Revolution, the economists' discussion of work, the lessons of history, and a few concluding thoughts for the future. Well, the Western, work in history, the Western concept of work really starts with the disdain for work of the ancient world. Working for a living was despised. The good life was one devoted to politics in the Greek conception and self-cultivation in the Roman conception. This ideal depended on slaves doing what we call work. Slaves, said Aristotle, were tools, and they were tools by nature. But he had one extraordinary thought. One day, he thought, mechanical tools might replace human tools. The ancient contempt for work couldn't survive, of course, the decay of slavery as an institution, but vestiges of it have lingered in all aristocratic societies. This explains not just the high approbation of leisure by Keynes and the elite of Keynes's day, all of whom were educated in the classics, but also the hostility to the idea of leisure by the majority, who associated both with the idleness of the rich, but more particularly with unemployment. The Chicago School of Economics notion that being out of work represents a choice for leisure is the conceit of economists who have never experienced a day's unemployment in their lives. With Judeo-Christianity, the story gets more complicated. Work is the primal curse, the punishment by God for Adam's sin for eating the forbidden fruit of knowledge. But at the same time, with that curse goes the divine injunction to cultivate the fruits of the earth, which God has bestowed. Properly understood, God's punishment was not to make people work, because they were working before the forbidden fruit. They were tilling, Adam was tilling the ground, but to make work more painful. Anthropology reflects the biblical story in the idea of original affluence. Hunter-gatherers needed everything around them, but conversely, they had everything they needed. Hunting wasn't work. Work enters human history with agriculture. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. The monastic economy was built on the precept, ora et labora, pray and work. Now, the productive unit in the pre-modern world was the household, not the factory. Work and life weren't separated in the way they became later on. The division of labor was internal to the household. Unlike the ancients, the Middle Ages also attached importance to craftsmanship, to making things. The medieval economy comprised farms and manufactories in small towns, which were little larger than villages. The professions had their origins in the guilds, urban guilds of skilled workers. Yet everyone in this kind of economy was skilled in some way, in the sense that their work involved knowledge of many of the stages of production, and not just the tiny bits of it, as in Adam Smith's pin factory. The nature of the work forced people to be multitasked, and associated with being multitasked was having multiple incomes, with typically the putting out system providing extra income for farmers in the fallow season. The social and political structure was hierarchical. Everyone had their place and their reward in the scheme of things. Religion offered solace for earthly suffering. Universal insatiability, which was greatly emphasized by economists later on, was still in the future. It wasn't there, because everyone had their place in this world. They were at home where they were. In the late medieval world, commerce spread within Europe and between Europe and other lands, but it was on the fringes. there was certainly temporary and permanent redundancy of population in this time, but it was caused by harvest failures, wars, plagues, not by competition from machines. Then you move on, fast forward. With the Enlightenment, the idea of work came to be associated not with the husbanding of nature, but with the overcoming of nature, the human project which has dominated Western history ever since. It was human participation in this project, made possible by science, which was supposed to set the whole of humanity free, and not just the small minority of the wealthy and powerful. Machines with a democratic promise. The particular form of progress which excited the 18th century imagination was the growth of wealth, the growth of riches. The end of production is consumption, said Adam Smith. The more goods there were, the happier we'd all be. The new human project spurred inventiveness. The accumulation of wealth required machinery, since human work alone could not wrest more than a limited amount of produce from nature. The Industrial Revolution changed the human link to work in a profound way. It replaced artisan by mechanic and home production by factory production. We've entered the age of capitalism, the economists and economic motives. Now, we come to the economists. Economics was known as the dismal science, by the way, when it started, and I'll explain why it was known as the dismal science in a minute. It was, by the way, Ricardo who coined the phrase redundancy. The fact that work was held to be the necessary means to enjoyment, you had to work in order to get the goods you needed to be happy, didn't mean that work itself was enjoyable. The economist's conception of labor shed any idea that it was naturally or intrinsically satisfying. Work was not a curse, but it was a cost. The cost of consumption. For without work, there would be no money to buy things. Lenin, that arch-economist, put it with his customary bluntness, under communism, who does not work shall not eat. By the same token, though, any reduction in this cost of work by the use of machinery opened up a brighter future, more output and therefore more money for less effort. And that's why economists unanimously welcomed the dawn of the machine age. As David Ricardo explained in the first edition of the Principles of Economics, which may appear, if we're lucky, there we are. You've already read it, so I don't have to dwell on it anymore. But basically, two points, I think, emerge very, very clearly from that. Notice his bit about the human stomach. The narrow capacity of the human stomach, of course, meant that insatiability doesn't lie here, it lies in the mind. The ability to imagine more and more and more things. And Ricardo thought this is actually what would drive forward the progress of wealth. First, though, two things to notice about that. The treatment of supply, that is capital and labor, as malleable or fluid, based on the assumption of wage flexibility, geographic mobility, easy transferability of skills. In other words, workers employed in producing stockings can be squeezed almost costlessly into the right shape for producing widgets or anything else, without any sort of real gap. That's the sort of typical economics assumption. The second, of course, is the assumption of insatiability as the key motive driving forward the progress of wealth. In fact, Ricardo anticipates Lionel Robbins's famous definition of economics as, I quote, a science that studies human behavior as a relationship between limited resources and unlimited wants that have alternative uses. Now, that's 1932. Unlimited wants, scarcity versus unlimited wants. How do you organize life confronted with this element of supply and this element of demand? And all of economics is about that, nothing else. That's the whole problem of economics. And it's there in that definition. So, you think, okay, this is Ricardo's view of things. But by 1821, the third edition of the Principles, Ricardo had changed his mind. The interval had seen the most intense period of the Luddite disorders, the revolt of the weavers against the introduction of machines in the north of England, and also a sort of important little book by someone who's now utterly forgotten, John Barton. And John Barton wrote a book called Observation on the Circumstances Which Influence the Condition of the Labouring Classes in England in 1817. And Ricardo read it, and he added a chapter on machinery to his Principles. And what Barton said was that capitalists could just as well invest their profits in new machines as in additional labour. And if they did so, then a section of the population would be redundant. And Ricardo read this, and he said, Barton is right. Two conclusions from his chapter 31 have been debated ever since. The first was his endorsement of Luddite economics. This is what he wrote. The opinion prevailing, I quote, in the labouring class, that employment of machinery is frequently detrimental to their interests, is not founded on prejudice and error, but is conformable to the correct principles of political economy. Second, he wrote, that to the extent that this opinion is true, that in fact the Luddites were correct, there will necessarily be a diminution in the demand for labour. Population will become redundant, and the situation of the labouring classes will be one of distress and misery. So it was the notion of the population becoming redundant which still strikes fear in those who dread the coming of the robots. Population becoming redundant, surplus to requirements. Now, Ricardo was the founder of economics, and he didn't, of course, leave the discussion on that exact note. He didn't think that redundancy was inevitable. Higher profits could lead to increased saving, leading to more investment, which would lead to more employment. This meant that a portion of people, I'm quoting again from him, thrown out of work in the first instance, would be subsequently employed. And if, as a result of the increased saving, the same gross produce was produced as before, there need not be any redundancy of people. Nor did he add slowing down the progress of automation. For if a capital, I'm quoting here, is not allowed to get the greatest net revenue that the use of machinery will afford here, that is, in Britain, it will be carried abroad, this capital, and this must be a much more serious discouragement to the use of labour than the most extensive employment of machinery here. Now, it's very interesting, this argument. He said, if a country doesn't exploit to the maximum the potential of machine production, the capital will go elsewhere, and the capital will be developed somewhere else, and then the original country will lose. That means the race for being more and more up-to-date, and having more and more up-to-date machines must go on forever and ever. And it's quite interesting to see that Ricardo's argument against a country slowing down the speed of mechanization, for the sake of human values or something like that, is echoed in the most recent report on the future of work to have come out of the United States. According to the Council of Foreign Relations Independent Task Force report number 76 on the work ahead, machines, skills and US leadership, April 2018, they all have titles like this. America would lose its best and its brightest if it tried to hamper its own technological development. Yeah? So the same argument as Ricardo, exactly the same, was using in 1821. Now the subsequent debate, let me turn very, very briefly to it, much too briefly. Central to the debate as it developed between about 1821 and the 1930s, 1940s, was the concept of compensation. That was the central point. Workers made redundant by machines would lose their livelihoods and perhaps even the satisfaction which their work had brought them, but they would be compensated by increased consumption, increased number of goods, and alternative employment, which the increased demand for goods and services opened up. Now, there are lots of variations of this argument. One of the interesting bits is Schumpeter, the economist Schumpeter, made a distinction between process innovation and product innovation. Process innovation would mean humans were replaced by machines. But in doing that, But by that happening, process innovation would lead to product innovation, which there'd be more and more goods to buy, and therefore an increased demand for labor. So process innovation leads to product innovation. The story is basically a happy story. There are different types of compensation. You can have extra saving, because your profits go up as labor's cheapened. You get economists, businessmen save more investment, and therefore you get a compensation on the investment side. The general reduction in prices leads to additional demand for products. If a whole lot of products are cheaper, people have more money to buy additional products, because they've saved money on the products that have been cheaper. Cheapening of the supply of labor means that there's going to be more employment of labor, and so on. And all these theories of compensation were attempts to say to the Luddites and the successors, look, don't worry about this. In the short run, you're going to lose. But in the long run, your children, and even you maybe, if you reskill yourself sufficiently quickly, are going to benefit from the introduction of these machines. But of course, how quickly these compensations come into play depends crucially on how fluid capital and labor are between occupations and regions. So this is sort of not clear. I mean, the economic assumption that people would move around instantly from one job to another. Capital would switch from one, everything would move from one place in the world to another without any lags at all. Of course, it's completely wrong. And so gradually, they were forced to conclude that there would be short-run disruptions, but long-run benefits. In the short run, things might be bad, but in the long run, they're going to be glorious. Now, as we know, Marx denied that any such compensatory processes were at work at all, either in the short run or in the long run. That is under capitalism. The story he told has no happy ending. Under the spur of competition, individual companies are compelled to invest as much of their profits as possible in labor saving, that is, in cost-cutting equipment. But increased mechanization doesn't benefit capitalists as a class because the competition still goes on, the super profits are competed away, and then they have to make more and more people redundant. And so basically, what happens is you get a reserve army of the unemployed, reserve army of labor, which is constantly being replenished and expanded as competition forces capitalists to introduce more and more machinery. Thus, Marx was able to write that mechanization froze laborers on the pavement. And so Marxist type unemployment is essentially technologically caused unemployment. The distributional effects of technical change, outlined by Marx, have featured prominently in economist discussion. And I can sort of say a bit more about the distributional consequences of the, it depends really whether the introduction of machinery is labor saving, whether it's capital saving, or whether it's neutral. Economists discuss all these things. But what we can say is that recently the impact of machinery on income has been to increase inequality and to skew the distribution of income towards the owners of capital. The wage share has been going down since about 2004-05. So it's having that effect at the moment. Now, that's the briefest sketch of a complex technical debate. Lessons of history. Now, this is more of a fun section, I think, because what does history tell us? History is more fun than economics, really. But you have to pay attention to both. What happened to the handloom weavers? Well, they just got obliterated. They were made totally redundant. 240,000 handloom jobs disappeared between 1829 and 1860 as power looms surged ahead. Their wages went down from 23 shillings an hour to 6 shillings an hour, and then lower and lower. And finally, they were made redundant. And a well-known economist at the time advised them to get out of that branch of production. Well, they got out. I mean, they died off. Some of them went abroad, But anyway, the handloom weavers are obliterated. But what about the larger picture? Wasn't it true that, in fact, in the long run, things got a lot better? And in a way, you can make that argument. Population in Europe, minus the Russian Empire, grew from 152 million to 315 million between 1800 and 1915. That is over the course of a century. And between 1890 and 1915, the period of maximum emigration, about 40 million people left Europe for the New World. That is, out of 150 million increase, about 40 million left for the New World. Had this vent for surplus population not existed, Europe might well have experienced severe population redundancy in the 19th century. And one should say that migration has always been nature's way of adding to population or reducing it, as indeed it is in Europe today. We must bear in mind that the people losing population are from Eastern Europe on the whole, and the people gaining it are in Western Europe, Western and Central Europe. It was the existence of overseas emigration outlets in the Americas, generally for permanent settlement, that helped overcome the Malthusian problem in Europe. Now, here's another thing that I've got some population figures, but they're not terribly interesting. I'll skip them. That just basically illustrates what I've just said. Percentage of European population migrating to the United States. But here's something more interesting, I think. The extra wealth brought about by machines made possible voluntary retirement from the labor force, a possibility which had been discounted by the earlier generation of economists who were fixated on scarcity. From the mid-1800s, hours of work started to fall from a peak of 60-70 hours a week to about 55 hours by 1914, and then they went on falling further throughout the 20th century as workers took out some of their income gains in greater leisure. One of the things to notice about this graph is that from about 2000 onwards, or maybe even a bit earlier, you have a flattening out of the curve. Why doesn't it go on? And lots of people have argued about this, but basically hours of work have fallen very, very little on whatever measure you take since about towards the end of the last century. And this is the theoretical account of what happens. I mean, as wage rates go up, people actually work more because they want more income. As they get a bit sated with the higher wages, they start working less. I mean, that's a sort of typical economist stylization of what has substitution effect followed by income effect. Then, in other words, through various mechanisms, the 19th century didn't see a general redundancy of population. Machinery enabled the economy to support a larger population than before, one that had almost doubled in size at a higher real income. Despite the increase in population, labour's share of gross domestic product remained constant throughout the industrial age, so they were getting some of the fruits of the new machinery. A small degree of redundancy of population is reflected in emigration figures. A substantially larger degree of voluntary redundancy in reductions in hours of work. Economists were surely entitled to say that such losses as were incurred in the meaning of work, in the quality of work, and the more unsettled conditions of work, were more than compensated in the long run by the vast gain in material well-being which the machines had brought about. Now, in conclusion, a few thoughts about today and tomorrow. We know that the speed and power of mechanization has accelerated dramatically. The decisive new advance has been in automated technology and, of course, the digital economy, which everyone now talks about, which thrusts mechanization far deeper into the world of work than in the past. In other words, into the cognitive aspects of work rather than the physical aspects. Of course, there was always some penetration, but it's got very, very much faster and more dramatic, and the power of computing has accelerated. And it's difficult to grasp the enormity of these changes going on before our eyes because we don't have enough distance from them. And no one really knows what the effect is going to be on jobs. There are just lots of different estimates. But history and theory can offer some guide. The theorizing provoked by automation, which I talked about, that is in terms of compensations, that was the big 19th and early 20th century theory, has been largely replaced by a different theory now, and it's called complements. I don't mean I compliment you on your lovely your wonderful essay. Complements in the sense of additions to. Those sort of complements. The theory of complements. This holds that while one effect of automation will be to displace some workers by machines, as in self-driving vehicles, I mean, the drivers are just gone from the vehicle. A more powerful effect will be to enlarge the human capacity to complement or to work with machines. Thus, the new production processes are best viewed in this theory of complements as hybrid, using both human and machine labor to greater and greater effect. A favorite example is the chess match. A good computer can beat the best human chess player, but the best computer, which combines with the best human chess player, will beat the best computer. In other words, humans will continue to add value to machines. I mean, this is the theory of complements. There's no need for them to race against the machines, a race they're bound to lose, by the way. Rather, they will race with machines to an ever more glorious future. Why they should go on racing forever and ever isn't made very, very clear. Most races come to an end at some point. Not this race, it just goes on till eternity. So this theory, as we can see, replaces the old demand-side theory of compensations with a supply-side story based on the stimulus machinery gives to the development of human capital. In other words, this is all part of the narrative of the knowledge economy, which is sort of sprouting up everywhere. However, I think there are two big flaws in both both components of the optimistic view, whether you take the theory of compensations or whether you take the theory of complements. The two major weaknesses of the compensation theory are, first, that it accepts that for most people work has no value except as a means to consumption. And secondly, it assumes insatiability or permanent discontent with what there is. Those are the two flaws, I think, in the compensation theory. Work has no value in itself, and insatiability is insatiable. It just goes on and on. So then you need a theory. That's the basis of the theory of compensations. The flaw in the theory of complements lies in its vast overestimate, I would argue, in human capacity. There's no reason at all why human mental capacity in general should increase at the same rate as machine mental capacity. A minority will be able to race with the machines in the knowledge economy, sure enough, but a substantial fraction may not, and they will be what is now called left behind. And what's to happen to them? Already left behind symptoms and reactions to them can be seen in increasingly precarious employment, falling wages, and political reactions, populist protests against both automation and one of its chief agents, globalization. Moreover, even if these distempers are only temporary effects of the displacement of labor, optimists themselves concede that the transitional period may last for decades. I mean, transitions that last for decades, that is a generation wiped out. That's just transitional. This idea, you see it in Ricardo, that you can switch from making stockings to widgets, in a second. Suddenly it's now stretched out for decades, these transitions. And I mean, then you really do need to worry very seriously about the cost you're inflicting on the human population. Redundancy is not a matter of 2 days, it's a matter of 10, 20, 30 years. That's a different kettle of fish. That's the idea that a supply shock like automation will automatically set in motion acceptable compensatory mechanism or complementary responses seems to me to be pure delusion. There will, of course, be responses, but they are likely to be highly disruptive and may even be destructive. So, given this, policy must pay much more attention to correlating the rate of change with the capacity of human society to absorb it. This will include slowing down the speed and spread of automation, ensuring its material fruits are equitably distributed, maintaining an adequate level of demand, and providing income guarantees to offset growing precariousness in the job market as robotization presses wages downwards and destroys jobs. And that seems to me about as much as policy can be expected to do. None of this, though, addresses the question raised by Michalski and Patočka, with which I opened my lecture, how humans can be enabled to feel at home in a world governed by an inhuman, if not intentionally inhumane, logic. In such a world, the algorithm will be king. Redundancy will see humans not so much displaced by robots as controlled by robots in a new division of labor, which has superhumans at the top, robots in the middle, and the rest of us somewhat rebelliously at the bottom, given our marching orders by the machines, who have been programmed by the super elite. So, we've reached the gates of science fiction, which is perhaps a good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this really wide-ranging talk. I announced it as the future of work. What we have now got is a short history of work. It's past the current dilemmas which we face and also some dystopian futures unless we learn to steer against it. But what I found particularly interesting is that you not only have policy prescriptions, but you really are making an appeal for us to treat economics as a moral science, to go back to questions of values and of the good life and how we would like to lead our own lives quite independently of what the forces are which would define it for us. So I think this is a really wonderful way to begin. What I would like to say, however, would be an informal discussion. I don't want to open it to questions to the public, but Lord Skidelsky has agreed that we end the evening here. I would like to thank you in the name of the IWM and equally in the name of Professor Briggs and the Diplomatic Academy for attending. But please feel free to stay on and come up and continue an informal conversation with him because he would prefer that. He's also happy to sign books if you would like him to do that. What I would also like to close on is another invitation to a lecture on another burning issue of our time, not only how we are going to manage the question of work and redundancy, and I think the interesting question which you link it to is the whole demographic question and the Marx and Malthus debate, which I think continues in the demographic anxieties of our times. We have on the 3rd of May, Ira Katz-Nelson at the IWM, this time asking the question, who is the people? Reflections on popular sovereignty, and he will try to address the question of who constitutes the people, by what criteria maybe define them, and what should be the institutions by which we should let ourselves be governed. So I would like to invite you on the 3rd of May at 6 o'clock to the IWM. And please feel free to continue an informal conversation here for a little while. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.